1,300 men moved through the humid night, their muskets drained of gunpowder. Steel bayonets caught the faint moonlight on the jagged cliffs of Stony Point. The order was absolute, whispered through the ranks like a death sentence. No soldier was permitted to fire a single shot until the British works were breached. General Anthony Wayne stood at the head of the column, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Before them loomed the fortress, a silent stone guardian over the Hudson River. The fate of the American supply line at West Point hung in the balance. Total surprise was the only path to victory against the entrenched British garrison. The silence of the night was about to shatter into a 30-minute slaughter. General Anthony Wayne led his corps of light infantry into the marshy terrain. The Hudson River lapped against the base of the rocky promontory. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson commanded the British forces holding the summit. Sir Henry Clinton had established this garrison to choke off American communications. The British had transformed the cliffside into a maze of abatis and earthworks. Wayne divided his force into two columns to strike from the north and south. The darkness provided the only cover for the approaching American infantry. Every man carried his weapon as a club, ready only for the cold bite of steel. The password for the operation echoed quietly through the lines. The fort's ours. The columns converged on the center of the British works at 1 in the morning. The sudden appearance of the Americans triggered a desperate scramble within the fort. British sentries shouted alarms as the first wave of attackers reached the abatis. The silence vanished under the sound of steel clashing against defensive timber. General Anthony Wayne surged forward with his men toward the inner ramparts. A musket ball struck the general in the head, sending him reeling to the ground. He pulled himself up, bleeding, and ordered his men to carry him into the fort. The soldiers pushed through the gaps, their fixed bayonets driving the defenders back. The engagement became a brutal, close-quarters struggle for control of the summit. The British garrison of the 17th Regiment of Foot fought to hold their ground. Men grappled in the dark, the flash of steel illuminated by the occasional muzzle blast. The Americans broke through the final line, turning the British own defenses against them. The struggle lasted exactly 30 minutes before the garrison surrendered the position. The 17th Regiment of Foot ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. General Anthony Wayne secured the objective, but the cost of the victory remained high. 15 American soldiers lay dead, and 83 others suffered wounds. The British lost 20 killed, 74 wounded, and 472 captured. 15 heavy cannons stood silent as the Americans claimed the spoils of the fort. The promontory soon became a grim repository for the fallen of both armies. Mass graves were dug into the rocky soil of the Hudson shoreline. British and American soldiers were buried together in the earth they fought to hold. The victory left the Continental Army in possession of a vital strategic point. General George Washington surveyed the reports of the successful night assault. He weighed the tactical value of the fort against the risk of its defense. The position remained exposed to British naval power on the river. Holding the promontory required diverting critical troops away from the defense of West Point. The triumph at Stony Point was a fleeting moment of dominance in the Hudson Valley. The rocky summit of Stony Point rose sharply from the Hudson River. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson inspected the defenses of the British garrison. His soldiers occupied the high ground to dominate the river traffic below. The 17th Regiment of Foot manned the primary defensive lines across the cliff. Detachments of the 71st Regiment of Fraser's Highlanders reinforced the position. Provincial Loyalist units bolstered the ranks within the stone and timber walls. Engineers had constructed a complex network of abatis along the perimeter. Sharp branches pointed outward to snag any infantry attempting to scale the slope. Deep trenches carved into the soil provided cover for the British riflemen. The fort served as a vital anchor for Sir Henry Clinton's regional strategy. It effectively severed the primary American communication line toward West Point. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson maintained a constant watch over the surrounding forests. His men patrolled the marshy lowlands that ringed the base of the promontory. The British artillery stood ready to fire upon any vessel navigating the Hudson. 15 heavy cannons sat behind earthen ramparts pointed toward the dark water. Supplies of flour and ammunition occupied the central storehouses of the fort. The garrison lived with the constant expectation of an American counteroffensive. They kept their muskets primed and their bayonets sharpened for a night assault. The steep terrain offered a natural advantage to the defenders on the summit. Every path toward the peak remained exposed to British fire from the heights. The soldiers of the 17th Regiment felt secure within their perimeter of logs. They did not suspect that the silence of the night concealed an approaching army. The Hudson River mist swirled around the base of the rocky cliffs. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson remained confident in the strength of his stone fortress. The Strategic Command in New York believed the position was nearly impregnable. British sentries stood at their posts, scanning the shadows for any movement. The fate of the Hudson Valley rested on the vigilance of the garrison. The American threat remained a distant concern until the night of the assault. The soldiers prepared for another quiet watch over the river and the woods. The clock struck 12:30 on the morning of July 16, 1779. General Anthony Wayne divided his force into two distinct columns. The northern detachment moved silently toward the British defensive perimeter. The southern column followed the rocky shoreline to approach from the river. Thick darkness swallowed the movements of 1,350 American infantrymen. Every soldier carried a musket devoid of powder and ball. The steel of their fixed bayonets caught the faint moonlight. They advanced in total silence to preserve the element of surprise. The British sentries scanned the shadows above the marshy lowlands. A sudden movement near the abatis triggered a frantic British alarm. Shouts from the ramparts shattered the stillness of the night. British muskets flared as the defenders fired into the dark. The American advance shifted from a stealth march to a frantic charge. Soldiers shouted the designated password to identify their comrades. The words, "The fort's ours," echoed across the rocky summit. The two American columns converged simultaneously at the center of the works. General Anthony Wayne surged toward the inner ramparts with his men. A musket ball struck the general in the head during the scramble. He collapsed onto the rocky ground as the battle intensified. Blood streamed from his forehead as he pulled himself upward. He ordered his men to carry him forward into the fort. The American infantry pushed through the gaps in the timber defenses. Fixed bayonets drove the British defenders back from the walls. The engagement devolved into a brutal struggle for control of the summit. The 17th Regiment of Foot fought to hold their ground. Steel clashed against defensive timber in the narrow corridors. The occasional muzzle blast illuminated the faces of the combatants. Americans broke through the final line of the British earthworks. The soldiers turned the captured British defenses against the remaining garrison. The struggle for the promontory lasted exactly 30 minutes. The British garrison surrendered the position shortly after 1 in the morning. The dawn light revealed the aftermath of the 30-minute assault. Red-coated soldiers lay scattered among the broken timber of the interior works. The 17th Regiment of Foot ceased to exist as an operational fighting unit. General Anthony Wayne's infantry stood amidst the wreckage of the British defensive perimeter. 20 British soldiers died during the chaotic bayonet charge. 74 men of the garrison suffered varying degrees of wounds. American soldiers rounded up 472 British prisoners from the smoking ruins. The capture of such a large force dealt a severe blow to British morale. General Henry Clinton lost a significant portion of his regional command in one night. 15 heavy cannons stood silent behind the captured earthen ramparts. American supply officers tallied the vast stores of flour and military equipment. The fort held enough provisions to sustain a large force for weeks. The Continental soldiers gathered the discarded muskets from the muddy ground. General Wayne secured the site to prevent a swift British counterattack. The logistical victory provided the American Army with much-needed artillery. The 17th Regiment had served as the backbone of the British Hudson defenses. Its destruction forced the British command to reconsider their grip on the river. The prisoners sat under guard while American troops cleared the debris of battle. The capture of these supplies bolstered the meager resources of the Continental forces. General Wayne inspected the captured ordnance as the morning sun climbed higher. The success of the assault shifted the tactical balance along the Hudson River. The British military hierarchy struggled to account for the sudden loss of the garrison. The 17th Regiment vanished from the front lines of the Revolution. Only a few men escaped the promontory during the final minutes of the fighting. The battle concluded with the American flag raised over the stone walls. The strategic cost to the British Crown proved higher than the loss of men alone. The capture of the stores left the remaining British outposts vulnerable to shortages. General Wayne waited for further orders from his commander-in-chief. The silence returned to the cliffs of Stony Point as the wounded received care. The morning sun illuminated the rocky summit of Stony Point. Freshly turned earth marked the ground near the ruined fortifications. Soldiers from the Continental Army dug deep trenches into the soil. The heat of mid-July accelerated the decomposition of the fallen. Gravediggers stacked the bodies of British and American soldiers together. The uniforms of the 17th Regiment of Foot lay stained with mud. Nearby, the homespun linen of the American infantry rested in the dirt. Both sides had fought with savage intensity for this single piece of ground. Now the combatants shared a final, silent resting place on the promontory. General Anthony Wayne's men stood over the open pits in the silence. The smell of black powder lingered in the humid river air. Broken muskets and shattered timber littered the landscape around the burials. The victory had demanded a heavy price in young lives. General Wayne surveyed the scene of the carnage from the parapets. He saw the physical toll of a 30-minute bayonet assault. The promontory transformed from a strategic outpost into a grim burial ground. Local birds circled above the exposed ridge of the Hudson River. The site served as a testament to the brutality of the conflict. Men who had marched from distant lands lay buried in the New York rock. The earth reclaimed the debris of the brief, violent struggle. No monument stood to mark the exact location of the mass graves. The soldiers abandoned the summit shortly after the burials were complete. The wind swept over the newly filled pits on the cliffside. Nature began to cover the scars of the battlefield within days. The memory of the struggle remained tied to the quiet river cliffs. The grave on the Hudson represented the cost of the American campaign. George Washington studied the maps of the Hudson River Valley. He assessed the vulnerability of the American supply line at West Point. The promontory at Stony Point sat too far from the main army. He determined the position required too many men to hold securely. On July 18, 1779, the order arrived from the commander-in-chief. Continental soldiers began the systematic destruction of the British fortifications. They dismantled the timber defenses and leveled the earthen walls. The men burned the barracks and filled the newly dug trenches. They hauled the captured heavy artillery back toward the American lines. General Anthony Wayne supervised the evacuation of his remaining infantry. The Continental Army abandoned the rocky summit under the cover of night. The British returned to the site shortly after the Americans retreated. General Henry Clinton found only the charred remnants of his former garrison. The British military realized the position was no longer worth the cost. They abandoned Stony Point entirely by October of 1779. The wind howled over the empty, scarred rock of the riverbank. The site stood as a hollow, deserted monument to the brief struggle. Nature reclaimed the broken stone and the hidden, unmarked mass graves. The river continued its slow, steady flow past the abandoned ridge. You walk the same ground now, though the trenches have long since vanished into the grass. You stand where the bayonets once shimmered in the dark, and you realize the silence here is not peace. It is merely a waiting. The cycle of the river remains, and you are standing exactly where they fell.